Are you ready to go on an adventure? Will you go on a journey with me? About 10 or 11 years ago, I started on this journey, and it's the journey of discovering the hidden legacy. And I'm just inviting you to hang out with me on this journey for a few minutes today. After taking classes related to science of mind for decades, one day I thought, except for one person, I don't see anybody being held up as an innovator, as an achiever, as a leader who's Black. And that can't be true. So I started asking questions. And I was shocked that everybody I asked just about was like, oh, I don't know the name of anybody Black who, wrote a book or who was a significant teacher in the history. And they could name people who were currently involved in the movement, but not any of the people who had laid the foundation. So I started saying, I am going to find out. And what happened for me was that I became driven by curiosity to find out who had contributed. And that curiosity led me through the journey up until now. Why do I talk about this as hidden legacy? Well, think about it. When I think of the word hidden, I think of something that's out of sight or unseen, or maybe even covered up. And when I think about the word legacy, I think about what gift has come from someone who lived before or who has experienced something before, or the meaning of life that comes from someone who's passing it on, or maybe even an inheritance. So, of course, when we then put those two words together, hidden legacy, we get the gift, meaning, or inheritance that is out of sight, unseen, or covered up. Now, what's great about that is that the gift is still there. The meaning has been provided. The inheritance has been laid before us. But because it's not seen or because it's been covered up, we don't know about it. Now, I don't believe that the hidden legacy was hidden on purpose. I think for a while I did. It's like, why is it that no one Black is being brought up? What's up with that? But then I came across this Ernest Holmes quote, and it resonated with me. Here's what Ernest Holmes wrote. The limitations we find encircling us have but one source. They spring from our thought. They are the result of our negative habitual thought patterns, which may have been instigated by our past experiences or the blind acceptance of what now appear to be the wrong ideas and concepts of others. And all of a sudden, as I reflected on that quote, I realized I didn't have to be angry at the negative habitual thought patterns of the past. I didn't have to seek revenge for all of the people for decades who went through training or taught classes with the blind acceptance of what were really the wrong ideas and concept of others, that there were not Black people who deserved attention or celebration. That was a wrong idea, a wrong concept. But for generations, that was just blindly accepted as, oh, well, nobody else has mentioned that there was someone Black who wrote 8 books. No one else has mentioned that there was someone Black who created or coordinated the creation of a lot of the content that we use in our curriculum today. So there was just blind acceptance. And we know we can change things by changing our thoughts. So I want to share with you just maybe 8 or 10 people who have come up in my research that I think these names would be meaningful to you. I think these are names that everyone who studies religious science should be aware of. And I only have a few minutes to do this, so buckle your seatbelt and just take this in. In the 1930s and 40s, Sarah Flowers was someone who published at least 8 books. She had a weekly radio show, just like Ernest Holmes did, following in his example, and she was a full-time practitioner. She completed the professional studies in religious science in 1937. And one of her books really is about quantum physics before we were even using that term, Sarah Flowers. In the 1950s, a name that you should be familiar with is Mother Pearl, or Reverend Pearl C. Wood. And Mother Pearl founded the Triangular Church of Religious Science. And one of the things you should know about her is not only was she very powerful and very effective, so much so that her church was one of the ones that Ernest Holmes visited on Sunday mornings on a regular basis. But her legacy included, when she retired, her son-in-law became the minister. He had become a practitioner. He had studied religious science. He became the senior minister. And when he retired, her grandson became the senior minister. So Pearl C. Wood, often referred to lovingly as Mother Pearl, and then her son-in-law, Philip Pitts, and her grandson, Greg Pitts. In the last 30 years of the 20th century, a name that influenced our educational curriculum even to this day is Dr. Daniel Morgan. He worked on staff at CSL, and he really developed or coordinated the development of so much of our education that we are amending and updating now. But in addition to that, for 40 years, he was the minister of a very active and thriving community in Los Angeles. In the 80s and 90s, O.C. Smith was a minister, a beloved minister who built a very large religious science or center. And that name may sound familiar to you, and you're like, O.C. Smith, I've heard that name. I had heard that name. O.C. Smith won a Grammy for singing Little Green Apples, and he was a well-known musician in jazz and R&B circles. But I didn't know that he was a religious science minister until really, I guess, about 7 or 8 years ago. O.C. Smith. And number 5, Reverend Alma Lumsden. Reverend Alma grew up in Jamaica, but moved to New York for her education and to build her career. But along the way, she was introduced to science of mind and changed her career path to become a minister. Ultimately, she moved back to Jamaica and was the founder of Temple of Light Religious Science Center, and it still exists today. And when Reverend Alma retired, leadership transferred to Reverend John Scott. So Reverend John Scott, I'd like to call his name and speak his name because he is well known in our movement today as one of our living legends, one of those people who's been an active volunteer and leader, one of those people who has built and sustained a thriving center, and one of those people who is a beautiful demonstration of the principles we teach. A couple of other living legends that I must mention are both currently in the Oakland area. Rev E, or Reverend E, Dr. Eloise Oliver, was the longtime leader at East Bay Church of Religious Science and recently retired, but she is and can be credited for inspiring and training more ministers and practitioners than most. And so we really want to honor her and recognize her strength. And Reverend Dr. Francione, also currently located in the Oakland area, spent time both in Southern California and Northern California. And she too was a major influence in education, the focus on education and teaching people science of mind principles. One or two more I think I have time for. Dr. Alma Stevens is a prolific writer. She also was a minister in our movement for 40 plus years. And she is the author of 7 books that take our principles and apply them to the healing of mental, emotional, and physical conditions. So those are 9 people, and I'm going to squeeze in one more. Many of you know about Founders Church of Religious Science in Los Angeles. It opened in 1960. And that means that the architect who was hired to design Founders Church and to oversee the construction of Founders Church that was built, and those decisions were made in the 1950s. The architect and the person who oversaw construction of Founders Church was a Black man, Paul Revere Williams. So I hope that this information inspires you to learn more about the contribution of people who are Black in the teaching and practicing of science of mind. We currently have in our movement between 800 and 900 active ministers, and 10%, about 10% of those ministers are people of African descent. So if you know 100 ministers, or if you can name 100 ministers, I hope that at least 10 of them are people who are Black. We have 29 elected leadership positions in Centers for Spiritual Living globally. 10 of those 29 elected leaders are Black. If you are looking for a book that is written by someone who is trained in science of mind, we've amassed a list of more than 60 books that have been published by people who are affiliated with CSL or were trained in science of mind. And that list is growing. I'm getting additional ones every month. So there are many resources out there for you. For more information, you can always go to Facebook and search on the hashtag CSL Black History, all one word. But beyond that, just stay alert and be curious. Ernest Holmes said, think of the whole world as your friend, but you must also be the friend of the whole world. He didn't teach us to simply be friends with people who are like us. He taught us that we should be friends with all kinds of people. So as you expand your understanding of science of mind, and as you build relationships and teach and practice religious science, then I invite you to be a friend to all of the many kinds of people who are studying, teaching, and practicing science of mind. Join me in discovering the hidden legacy.